given to us to prepare us and to prove that he is in control. Now, like 2012, the movie and the theories, and other doomsday, that the Bible does predict that it's going to be very bad. It will be chaotic and destructive and fearful. It doesn't sugarcoat it. And we need to know. We need to be prepared. I look at point 2. Number 2, the world will not end on December 21, 2012. Like, wow, Pastor Dave, that's a pretty bold statement considering a lot of people disagree with you. I want to talk for just a moment about the date-setting Hall of Shame. This is great. I love doing this research. The date-setting Hall of Shame. How many of you ever heard anyone set a date for the end of the world or when Jesus is coming back? You've read some of those? Let me give you some famous ones. This was all the way back in 1284. Pope Innocent III in 1284 said that the end of the world is going to be this year. And do you know why he made that prophecy or made that pronouncement? It's because it was exactly 666 years from the time their arch enemy Islam was introduced. And the Catholics said, 666 years of Muslims, that's enough. God's got to come back and end this thing. Came and went. The year 1666, 1666, you can imagine that got everyone in a buzz. There were prophecy after prophecies. And then there was a great fire in London, and everyone said, this must be the end. And 1266 came and went. Probably the most famous predictions were by the Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witness predicted in 1914 that Jesus would come back and the world would end. They predicted the same in 1915, 1918, 1919, 1920, 1925, 1941, 1975, and again in 1994. I remember back when I was a kid living at home that there was a book that came out, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 88. How many of you ever remember that? Was that as big a deal in your area as it was in ours? I knew people that sold everything they had and sat and waited for Jesus to come back. In 1989, you could buy that book very cheaply. They were giving it away, okay? There's a pretty good chance if you're calling out a date, it's not going to happen, all right? Date setters are batting 0, and there's a reason why. Look back in Matthew chapter 24. Look down in verse 42. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day your Lord will come. Jump down verse 44. So you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. And you could pretty much doggone guarantee that if somebody puts a date on it, that's the safest day of the year. Just by that alone. But there's a few other things that we ought to know. First of all, when Jesus talks about a timeline of events, let me give you just a survey of a timeline of events. The first thing that we know that Jesus is making clear here is that there will be signs. There will be expectations. Hold on just a minute on the slide and we'll pull it up in just a moment. Let me talk about the signs for just a moment. There's 3 major signs I want to just bring to your attention. You probably have already observed this, but these are fascinating signs. The first one is Israel as a nation. Israel as a nation. Do you know that Jesus said, and he warned us, he said, keep your eyes open. We read it there in verse 42 and verse 44. In Matthew 16, he rebuked some of the Pharisees. He said, you guys can predict the weather, but you can't even see the prophecies that are being fulfilled before your very eyes. Talking about himself. He said, you can predict the sun, it's going to rain. He said, but you can't even see that the Son of Man is right here with you. And Jesus warns us to be watchful of the signs. Israel's a nation. Now, most of us in here do not remember a time when Israel was not a nation. It's been 62 years. So unless you're over 70, there's never been a time where you actually remember Israel not being a nation. Now, this is an amazing change of events. Very unpredictable, very unexpected, and very, very unlikely. The very notion that an ancient culture could preserve and maintain that culture for 2,000 years without a home country, without a land, without a base, without a place to call its own, maintain their culture for 2,000 years, then come back to the original location of their ancestors and start a new nation is amazing. Okay, let me give you an analogy. That would be like the Cherokee Indians for the next 1,800 years, keeping their complete heritage, traditions, customs, names, all of that for 1,800 years, and then coming back and saying, Georgia's ours. We're taking it back. Putting up, and America just going, okay, take Georgia, Can you imagine how unusual that would be? And not to mention their military might. That compared to their enemies, they have 30 million enemies, many of whom are very militant and radical, as if we didn't know that. And here's this little country, the size of New Jersey, with 7 million people in it, is the center. It's the hotbed. It's a boiling kettle pot of tension, of stress, of war, of fighting, of angry rhetoric, and all of this in just this little country. And that has happened in just over 60 years. Also with that, what's amazing, it sort of goes along in the same tone, is what has taken place in the Middle East over the past 50 years, and especially in the last 35 or 40 years. You see, 100 years ago, when Bible prophets and Bible scholars would read through, and they would see that the Middle East was the epicenter of all the end times events. And most of them were thinking, it's the desert. There's nothing there. There's camels and tents. You can't even find water. And it's going to be the epicenter of all the end times. And the Middle East was very obscure. And you can imagine, if you're reading 100, 200 years ago, you're thinking London, France, maybe Kiev, maybe Berlin, maybe the New World. And you're thinking through, why the Middle East? And there's 3 letters that tell us why. And you know what they are. O-I-L. Do you know the oil is the rudder of the economy? Something very fascinating happened in 1973. Most of us don't remember. Some of you do, because you remember waiting in line to get your gasoline. My dad happened to be the proud owner of an Exxon gas station in 1973. And I would hear stories about the long lines of people to where they had to regulate how much gas you could purchase. Do you know that's why they instituted the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit? It's a conservation method. Because almost overnight, the price of oil quadrupled. I mean, can you imagine if you went from paying $3 a gallon to $12 a gallon next week? Can you imagine how that would just stress and wreck everything? Almost quadruple overnight. And the reason they did that is because all the Middle East countries were fighting against Israel, and they said anybody that supports Israel, we're enforcing an oil embargo. And did you know that price never went back down? It never went back down. It's actually only gone up. And almost overnight, sheiks and Arabian owners and princes became billionaires. An incredible transfer of wealth went from the West to the Middle East. And almost overnight, after 2,500 years, those in the Middle East became major world players and powers. Third thing, globalization. You know, globalization, or global communication, you can speak to anyone, almost anywhere in the world. You can travel anywhere within a day. That you can... our military can reach any spot of the world. We have missiles that can touch and impact any part of the world. This mass globalization. And do you know that of all these things, the globalization, the Middle East and Israel, you know, it's been said, and I believe this is true, that it is easier today to rule the world than it was to rule a country just 100 years ago. Because of the way our communication and the way that our global network has shrunk. Even our global economy has become very interchangeable. So all of these things, the globalization, the increase and the shift of power and wealth to the Middle East, the relocation of Israel to their home country, just a few observations, those have happened in the last 60 years. Not hundreds and hundreds of years of development. These have happened very, very rapidly. It sounds almost like labor pains and contractions and preparations for a big event that is to come. So first, the Bible tells us that there will be signs. And by the way, just to go back to that oil thing, I thought this is fascinating. That almost half of the world's oil reserves are in Saudi Arabia. Arabia owns 22%, Iran 12%, Iraq 11%. Almost half are right there with these countries that we have very unusual relations with. The United States is in 11th place. We have just about 2.5% of the world's oil. Now, in contrast, we use 8 times more oil than Russia. We use 3 times more oil than China. Now, do the math for a moment. Number 11 in production, number 1 in consumption. It's kind of just something to think about. FYI. Anyway, nothing to do with the message. I thought you'd enjoy that. Let's look at verse 14 and 15. Here's why I make the proposition that the world will not end on December 21. Look down at verse 14 and 15. And the gospel of this kingdom will be preached to the whole world. We read that. As a testimony to all the nations, then the end will come. By the way, that's one of the other signs, that global world missions has almost reached and impacted every tribe and tongue and ethnicity. And we're working hard on that even as a church here. Verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy